All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Haley, and I'm a research coordinator here at the Center for MHealth and Social Media. I am honored today to introduce Professor Marcus Stallworth. Marcus LMSW is the co-owner of Welcome to Reality LLC, which focuses on providing media literacy and education for students and parents regarding social media and technology. Professor Stallworth and his team are credited for getting Public Act 1767 passed into law in Connecticut, mandating steps be taken to provide social media literacy education in all public schools. He is also a member of Media Literacy Now's National Advisory Council, which provides educators with advocacy and resources on media literacy education in schools. Today, Professor Stallworth will focus on the impact of social media and technology, with particular focus on current trends, the need for advocacy, and efforts related to the passage of Public Act 1767 in Connecticut. Thank you again for tuning in. Please wait until the end of the presentation to submit questions in the chat, and I will now turn things over to Professor Stallworth.
Fantastic. Haley, thank you so much. So good morning and afternoon to everyone who's joining us today. As stated, my name is Marcus Stallworth, and I'm very, very, very happy and excited to spend some time with you today. I know that in the introduction, it talks a little bit about some of the roles that I have the pleasure and privilege to be connected to. And I once again just want to thank all of you for taking time this afternoon or morning. The University of Connecticut, particularly the School of Social Work and other contributors. Welcome to Reality and the Child Welfare League of America as well. So in our time, as you'll see on the screen here, we're going to talk a little bit about social media use and its impact on well-being. So don't worry. I know many of us have experienced, Zoom fatigue and technology tiredness. My goal is not to sit here and talk at you the whole time. I'm certainly not going to pull up a bunch of slides and read to you like a bedtime story. So you'll see that I'll pull up some visual aids that might just support and reinforce the dialogue and discussion that we're having. And at the end of our time together, we already have made a commitment that we'll dedicate a little bit of energy for any kind of remaining or residual questions and answers, needs for answers that you might have. I will share this with you. What we also decided to do is make some adjustments. So I'm aware of some of the curiosities that some had before they registered. So I made intentional efforts to kind of weave some of those areas of interest into the actual conversation and discussion. All right. So here's a great example of this. So you'll see on the screen some of the objectives that we're going to talk about today, more or less in conversation and discussion based. So yes, we're going to talk a little bit about pros and cons of technology. It's not all great and it's not all bad. There also can be some connections and impact on well-being, socially, emotionally, behavior. A lot of ways that devices and apps could be a benefit, but some of them could have adverse impacts on children and adults. And then, like we talked about, we'll make sure that we dedicate some time for discussions and some suggestions for consideration. So here's a great example of some of the pros and cons that are here. So as your eyes are kind of glancing through both sides of this list, if you will, look at all the pros that are there. The first one is talking about communication has increased and people have larger networks. Due to technology, we have the opportunity to be here together, having a conversation, having discussion, sharing resources and information. On the other side, what you'll see is some of those cons. And those are some of the areas of concentration that we probably will focus on a little bit. So once again, as your eyes are kind of glancing through some of those bullets, I'd love just to highlight just a couple. Look at the very first one we decided to put up here. Reputation can be ruined instantaneously. I would go as far as that. Sometimes if you're upset or you're frustrated, you push that button, it's very hard to pull back some of those things that you've posted, tweeted, texted even perhaps, and in some cases, depending on your sophistication, sending out even email. And through some of these experiences, we've learned that there's been a lessened sense of responsibility, accountability, and even some of that social interaction has seemingly been spaced out a little bit. So we'll have an opportunity to talk about that. And I'd be remiss if we didn't take a moment to capture the last bullet at the bottom, where it talks about how users can become addicted. And that is something that we will be talking about in just a little bit. So let's just take a moment and take a walk back in time. So if you're like me and you're looking at some of these visuals, you might be able to think about some of these items that you either had, that you wanted, or might have been envious of others who had them and you did not. You know, there was a point in time if you had a boombox or even a Walkman. Let's not even talk about a cell phone. Not only was it an option for increased resources and shared information, it could have been connected to popularity or social status. If you don't know what these devices are, you're too little. But stick around. We're going to give you some information about those things in a bit. So once again, all of these were individual items that provided specific functions, and they were connected to information, leisure, or recreation. Can't forget the TV, of course. Now, in devices, what you will see is all of those resources plus more are all housed in one singular device. So, yes, it has increased a lot of access to information and technology for sure, but there are also a lot of responsibilities that are connected to them as well. How many of us are having these conversations with our loved ones or even with others that we're close to past the age of majority? So think about when we look specifically about technology and the impact on the developing child. So, sometimes when I have the opportunity and privilege to speak to groups of individuals, when they talk about introductions and how you want to be referenced, I really, really try to emphasize that we do not want to be looked at as content experts. An expert is someone who's done all the research, all the work, and has all the finite answers in this particular area. What we understand with this notion or this fluid experience of technology and social media, that it changes all the time. It changes all the time and it shifts. So, for example, I was prepared to talk to you a little bit about the technology and the impact on the developing child and how much screen time children are using today, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But guess what? As recent as the 5 a.m. news, there was a new study that was released saying that children are spending over 7 hours daily in front of the screen. So I think that's just a great example of how information can continue to evolve, and also as social workers for our need to continue to stay competent, stay relevant, and stay abreast on topics that we're working with. So let's talk a little bit about the cell phone addiction. I love this particular visual aid because, sometimes when I watch TV in those rare instances, and when you see commercials, there seems to be like a lot of medication commercials. And you watch them and they have these little sayings or phrases and they'll say, have you ever been feeling tired? Do you not have as much energy as you used to? Well, we have this magical pill that you can take and it'll give you your energy, help you rest better. And it talks about all these wonderful things and they have the visual to support it. Sounds enticing, right? However, if you listen really closely or you read the fine print, you'll hear all the adverse side effects that could be connected to it. And many of them supersede the benefit of actually considering to take the pill or whatever dosage or milligrams it happens to be. Technology is like that too. So I always said, one day I'm going to develop a commercial. And if I did, I would use these statements and turn them into questions. And it would probably sound something like this. Do you feel anxious without your cell phone? During face-to-face conversations, are you thinking about using your phone or start using your phone? In public in places, do you start using your phone? And are you documenting everything in your life? And wouldn't that be great if we had a magic pill that we can offer to individuals who have cell phones and they've become like an appendage to their whole life experience? Here's the one asterisk. If that was the case, if we had to add side effects, it could be impact on self-esteem, self-worth, ability to make positive social connections, cyberbullying, suicide ideation, mixed messages through media, and hypersexualized visuals that might impact your personal world, and how you connect with others. But that would be the fine print, and it's not there yet. That's part of the work that we do because we understand that it's important that we find ways to lift the awareness about the pros and cons. So there was a video here that I was going to share with you. I was kind of toggling on the fence if we were going to go ahead and do it. But with preparation, I made a decision on the fly. I'm not going to go ahead and show it. So I'll find a way to add it into the chat somehow, or I'll connect it to our resources so you can get it. But what this really was just talking about was an opportunity that we were able to do some information gathering at a local university that I was teaching at the time. And we really got some firsthand knowledge and experiences from college students about their obsession in many cases around the need for their phone. So I'll just show you some of the findings that we found. So let's just take a look. So look at these questions. And while I'm looking at them, I'm going to ask you respectfully and challenge you to see where you fall in this continuum. A lot of times the young people get a bad rap because they're like, oh, these kids, it's not just little kids. It's not just college students. It's full-fledged adults. And some of us, perhaps when I show you some of these questions, might fall into one of these categories right now. So take a look at what we asked. If you forgot your smartphone at home and you were headed to an appointment, would you turn around to go get it? 67% of the students said that they would turn around and go back and get their phone. So naturally, we had an expanded conversation afterwards in focus groups, and many of them said, even though it might mean breaking the law and going over the speed limit, that they would go back for their phone because they didn't feel like they could function properly without them. Take a look at this one. Have you ever gotten anxious when you realize your battery icon has turned red? Notice it says turn red. Doesn't say powered off, doesn't say cut off, just turn red, indicating that the battery's getting low. And once again, 67% of students, college students, said yes. Now, I've had the great privilege to teach just over 50 graduate and undergraduate courses in my academic career. A few here right at University of Connecticut. And there was a period of time when kids arrived, they wanted to sit in the back. Unless they had some visual needs, then some would sit in the front. And it was like a comedy show. Like whoever got there late, then you had to sit in the front rows, if you will. So towards the back or in the middle was where they typically would congregate. What we notice now, or at least in my experience, the prime real estate isn't in the back of the room or in the front where you can have more access to the screen. It's spaces that are closest to the outlets. Just think about that for a second. So for that anxiety and try to prevent that, they want to make sure that their phones are charged as high as possible with as much juice in it whenever they can. I just always find that fascinating. I'll just show you a few more. So then we ask this question. So when you're in class or at work, do you check your phone? 92% of students said yes, they do. So once again, I go back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago. We can't just say young people. We just can't say these kids. Some of that is applicable for adults as well, especially since we've been in this virtual space. Many of us have found ways to multitask and appear like we're looking and being present, but still, manipulating and using other devices simultaneously. And 92% is a huge number. So take a look at this one. We asked them, how many times a day do you check your phone to look at social media? Now, I'm a licensed social worker. I'm not a mathematician. But if you look at this pie chart, if you will, if you add 10 or more times with 6 to 10 more times, look at what that number is. That's well into the 80th percentile. So young individuals are checking their phones upwards of 10 plus times daily simply to look at social media. So that within itself yields the question to give pause and say, well, what is the connection? What is the lore and what is the need? And we all know about brain development and how fascinating the mind works. And there's a lot of phrases and terms and acronyms that can talk about what we're discussing. But for many, it really is or can be a fear of missing out. So here's an interesting one. We asked, so when texting someone, how long is your typical response time? And then once again, look at those response times. Almost half said 2 to 4 minutes is what they would do and what they would seem or consider acceptable. So the larger question is, what happens when you send a text and you do not receive a call back in those times? What happens? How does that increase or impact your thoughts, behavior, increased aggression? What happens? So when we ask some of our students, many of them say, well, then they would text again. Maybe emojis might have different expressions. Maybe they might even try to call them directly. And here was another interesting one. Some of them said that perhaps they'd even look on social media to see if they're connected, to see where they are and see, what might be something that could be holding them up for response time. So again, we're just talking about the evolving world that we're living in and that need to have that instantaneous gratification. And what's the parallel process to that in real world scenarios when many things in life require a little bit of determination, a little bit of will, and a little bit of patience. And here's the last one I would choose to show to you. So we asked, do you personally know anyone who's been bullied online? The specificity was online, and 60% of them says they did. When we asked secondary and tertiary questions about what did they do about it, many of them had responses like this: I did nothing at all, wasn't my problem, or it didn't impact me in any way. So I made an assumption that at some point somebody else would have reached out. So remember when we talked early on, some of those cons, that level of desensitization, that could be a great example of that. And then not only is there maybe a social obligation, but maybe even a moral obligation as well. So just all things to think about and ponder. So while you're looking at the screen here now, you'll see, and look at the title, things that didn't exist 20 years ago. So if we had more time, if we were actually in a legitimate full day, half day, 2 day course with certificate to CEUs, we'd spend lots of times talking about what are the apps that you currently use. We can measure, get information around frequency, and is it for personal, professional, et cetera, et cetera. But I'd ask you just to look at these here now for conversation purposes. Like I said, some of these didn't exist when many of us grew up. So for individuals, families, therapists, clinicians, direct support staff, these could be great entry points for dialogue and conversation. If the kids feel like you have no idea what's going on, not only could they seemingly get away with things under your nose and you might not know, they may feel like, I'm going to talk to you about this because you're nice and everything, mister, but you just don't get it. So once again, evolving in our thinking and trying to create in purposeful ways that we can have positive relationships and use technology in many ways. So let's just take a look at the other side of technology. So we highlighted a bunch of the benefits, and there could be some downsides as well. So I know we've heard a little bit about online pornography and different ways kids can get access to information, which is true. But I'd ask you to take a look at some of these statistics that are here. So notice the first one says that innocent word searches, 40% of kids get uninvited in that way. So in the essence of time, I won't go through a litany of sites, but I will say this. I'll give you a personal example, and perhaps this is kind of like a full circle moment. When I'm part of Connecticut's mental health emergency first response team, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I had an opportunity to play a role in the Sandy Hook incident that took place, providing crisis intervention and direct support for families in the community, et cetera. A year later, I found myself teaching right at this very university. And I received a last minute call from a representative from the organization I was connected to. And I was afforded the opportunity to participate in an event via the White House. So, of course, I was excited. I sent an email to my students and I said, hey, this is what's going on, class. This is Professor Stallworth. for this week. Tuesday's class, is going to be different in this kind of way. I said, what I asked you to do is here's the link to this site. I'd ask you to watch the messaging for President Obama about his thoughts around high assault rifles and caliber firearms. And I'd ask you for the class to write a 1.5-page reflection on what you think about it and how it applies to the class. Here's the website for the link, www.whitehouse.com, period. Thank you very much. Stay safe. See you next week. I made a critical yet innocent mistake. So if we were in real time, I'd ask you to unmute and see if you can guess what it was. But I wrote whitehouse.com instead of whitehouse.gov. And at the time, whitehouse.com was a free, hardcore pornography site. Yes, talk about teachable moments. So fortunately for the class, we were able to catch that very early and turn it into a learning moment. But think about how many kids who are in elementary school or in middle school who are doing a paper for school or a project, and they go to Google and they accidentally move one character or shift the domain name, what that could turn into. So some of those things are not by accident. Great strategy goes into trying to capture audiences who might not have the sophistication to know how to seek out particular sites. The larger conversation is how many kids would say something to their parents, and what would be some of the barriers that might prevent them from doing that. We'll take a couple of minutes to talk about that as well. So here in this section, I just wanted to show you a few numbers because it's child specific. Forgive me, I hope you can see past this little square icon in the corner. But essentially, this is talking about children and how they can get connected to online predators. So we all know, or many of us know, that many individuals with that mindset are looking for children who have unsupervised access to technology. Perhaps they do not have information or adults or caregivers to ensure their safety. And many of them are connected to the child welfare system, or in congregate care, or may have actually run away from their household. So here's this reinforcing piece that I wanted to highlight to you earlier. And look at the third bullet, if you would, please. So 25% of children who encountered a sexual solicitation told an adult. So for some of us, we might say, well, that's great. A quarter of them did. When we have additional conversations with students or children, when we ask them for those who didn't, one of the main reasons why they said they didn't want to tell their parents, one, because they didn't want to get in trouble, and two, they were afraid that their families were going to take all their access to technology away from them cold turkey. So just ponder that for a moment, that, in their young developing minds, they may have been willing to consider being persuaded or solicited to, rather than just tell adult because they were fearful that their access might have been denied. That's just fascinating to me every time I reference or reflect on that information gathering. So here's where we talk a little bit about the applications, and perhaps I could scoot this over a bit. So once again, notice it says dangerous apps that teens use, but these don't always have to be dangerous apps. So when we were talking earlier about the importance of being relevant, it doesn't just apply to being in the professional aspect. If you have children, if you have spouses, partners, paramours, significant others, there are lots of applications that could be wonderful. You can capture memorable moments. You could share videos. You could do wonderful things that could build memories in a positive way. However, some of those same devices could be used in different ways. So I'm only going to highlight a couple in the essence of time, and I'll highlight Snapchat. So Snapchat at first, believe it or not, was out. It wasn't really that popular, and then they kind of rebranded and put it back out. And one of the things that made it appealing for young people was allegedly you could send a recording, and after 5 or 6 seconds or so, it would go away, into the air. So this was a great entry point for young adults, in particular middle school and high school students, where maybe their boyfriend or person of interest would ask them to send them a lewd picture. And they're like, well, I'm not going to send you a picture because you might share that. But if I snap it to you, it's going to go away in 5 seconds. So nobody will see it. So we thought, well, in our travels in northern Saskatchewan out in Canada, we had a great learning experience from the students that we were working with directly. And one of them said this, well, there's two ways that you can get around that. One, if you're with another friend or you have an old phone, you can take a picture from your old phone and you still have the image. And the second was, if the phone is in airplane mode, you could take a screenshot. And in screenshot, if you take a screenshot that way, it won't send a notification back to the individuals. Who knew? So once again, even though there were safety instruments put in place so you'd be notified as the sender, there was ways that students or young people were able to circumvent that process. So again, how can you have an offer supports to the children that you're connected to and you support if you're not connected to the resources that they have and what the abilities really can be? So many of us by now know what Tinder is, kind of a site just for meeting people with maybe one or two pointed interests, mostly physical in nature in many cases. But they also have a Tinder for children. It's actually what's called Tinder for Teens. So if you look at it right now, you might not be able to find it as easily because they've shifted it and renamed it and rebranded it many times. It's almost like back in the day, if you have like a restaurant or in your neighborhood that might have went under, it's the same physical business, but it's under new management, that type of experience. But kids have access and a level of understanding much more than we do if you're not plugged in and actively in the know. And then the last two I'll share is TikTok. So we know TikTok is great. People have done fundraisers, great cute kids and babies, different visuals and images have gone viral. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. I've seen some individuals who have offered mental health support. There's something great called Sit With Me. And there was a particular individual who was struggling with suicidality, and he just asked for someone to sit with him. And someone sat with him, and then they shared it. And then they shared it. And before you know it, there was thousands of people that were wrapping their virtual arms around with support. The other thing with TikTok, although there could be some great household and food hacks, also could be trending things that could be dangerous. For example, this morning alone, I came across a new TikTok trend that's called Sleepy Chicken. Sleepy Chicken. Do your own diligence when you have moments and minutes to do so. But Sleepy Chicken is they're actually pouring NyQuil over chicken and then cooking it. So when those agents that are already have chemicals in it that help induce sleeping, when it's heated, it kind of amplifies the strength of it, and many people have had adverse impacts on that. So once again, how would you know if you don't know, and how could you have conversations with young ones or others if you're not aware? That's where that competency component is so important. And then lastly, not to snitch or tattle on anyone, you'll see the calculator app in the bottom. Many phones have like a applications that appear to be an application, but it's kind of like a front, and it might look like a calculator, but with the right code and the right sequencing, it could be a space where you could share information. Some people use it for account information, etc. But again, others use it for different intentions and different motives. So again, just wanted to share some of those things with you in the little bit of time that we are spending together. So out of all the visuals that I'm going to share with you, this is probably the most powerful in my opinion. Notice the limited amount of words and visuals, but look what it says. Some people see this as self-esteem. So that image could be a like, it could be a heart, it could be a retweet, it could be a repost, it could be hand clapping, whatever it is, it can equal self-esteem. So make these connections. What we're learning is sometimes if a young person posts something online, they're waiting for responses. And depending on how many likes you receive or don't receive, can have you affirm or question your friend circle, popularity, social status, etc. And what we're also learning, in some cases, the more extravagant or risk seeking or risk taking the effort or image or video is, seemingly the likes actually lift up. So, what kind of mixed messaging is that sending for kids? And what steps are individuals willing to take to receive likes? So again, when we talk about self-esteem, this is all tied in. They used to say a phrase back in the day, sticks and stones may break your bones, but words will never hurt you. I would make the argument that that is not true, particularly in the days of technology. Cyberbullying is a real thing. Here we're talking about for teens and teen suicide, but this bullying also happens with coworkers, with individuals in your neighborhood, with people who you've had strong connections with for many, many years. Once again, it goes back to that strength or stretch of responsibility because it's not firsthand in person, and it's much easier to say something via a couple of keystrokes than it might be in someone's face, person to person, one on one. So look at some of these visuals as you probably already did glance. So notice that bullying victims are 2 to 9 times more likely to commit suicide. That's according to a Yale study. Girls between 10 to 14 are even at higher risk. And then look at the last one. Nationally, about 130 kids a day stay home from school for fear of cyberbullying. That's astronomical. And let's be very clear. Even though we spent the last almost 2 years learning remotely, cyberbullying can still happen. As a matter of fact, it is elevated in certain parts of the country. So now we're talking about kids and we're talking about young ones. And, what do we do to kind of measure and check in on their safety and overall well being? Well, as parents, we're trying to figure it out, and so is the medical profession as well. So maybe when we went to school or when we grew up, or maybe our younger children, you go to the doctor, they'd ask a few questions and they'd say, "Hey, how you doing? How's everything going at school? Oh, you were into sports or track or cheerleading. How's that going? How's everything going at home? Anybody significant catching your eye? How's sleep? How's food?" Those kind of questions, whether we knew it or not, they were actually implementing portions of a medical psychosocial screening. So they would ask a little bit about home life. I'm just going to pull these up. Home life, education, activities, drug use, sexuality, and then sometimes safety. But look at in this new approach, what they're asking: suicidal ideation and social media use. So research has made direct connections and correlation to the same type of chemical releases that take place at a slot machine when you hit the jackpot, from when you experience a high from a particular drug or narcotic, and connected to some of those euphoric feelings, connected to some forms or responses through social media. They say those who really have strong dependency, like maybe a person struggling with alcohol use, before they get to taking the drink, sometimes their mouth can start to salivate in anticipation about what's going to happen next. So make those connections for those who perseverate on who's connected to them, who's responding, what's going on, how come I'm not there, how come I wasn't invited, how come they didn't reach back, why are my numbers so low? That could be stressful, anxiety inducing and producing, and it could connect to some of the other things that we've mentioned earlier. So we'd be remiss if we didn't talk a minute or two just about how advertisement impacts youth. On this visual age, I'm just going to give like a broad brush kind of paraphrase, and just look how many ads that teens view in a year. Over 40,000. If you divide that by 12 or by weeks, staggering numbers. The one I asked you to look at is the term right in the middle of your screen called disposable income. Disposable income. So if you're not sure what that is, I'll give you an example. So if your parents pay your cell phone, if you don't have to pay car insurance, if they help you with school clothes, and they take care of meals and utilities, but you still have money either from allowance, shoveling snow, cutting the grass, or some physical labor that you've done or your own job, that's called disposable income. money that you can use that's not dedicated for other monthly ongoing expenses. So advertisers are realizing, before we used to advertise to the parents and lean on their sense of guilt to get them to purchase things for their children. Now they're targeting the young people because they are the ones who have the most or access to disposable income. And once again, they've connected many of those items and merchandise to popularity, social status, et cetera, et cetera. And then take a look at these visuals. And again, we just pulled some random ones, and kudos to our master's level interns who put these visuals together. And just look at some of these that we wanted to share. Look at some of the sexualized or hypersexualized visuals. Look at some of those subliminal messaging, and look at them that are not so covert, very much overt. So when you look at those, let's just say for young people, in those very early stages of curiosity and exploration and trying to figure out who you are as young people, what do these messages suggest for some? So is this what I need to do to gain attention? Is this how I need to behave to be accepted? If this is how I need to dress or act to be in the loop, I don't know. But again, when you see messages repeatedly over and over and over, what kind of messages can it send to young people and adults, especially if it's not balanced with some alternatives? Also could say a lot about what the perception is around sexuality and appropriate intimacy in relationship with young people. So you say, okay, what in the world are we going to do with all of these things? So we made a decision, like many of us in the School of Social Work, most inventions that happened in the household were developed because they recognized there was a gap and then there was a need. So there was a point in time where there was large, heavy furniture that needed to be moved in the house. Perhaps someone didn't have the resources to help. They developed these little plastic rubber things that go right under the couch. They're called the movers or whatever the words they're used as variations, and help whisk that furniture quickly right across the rug. So we noticed that there was a gap specifically here in Connecticut around media literacy, and we recognized that children, adults, parents, clinicians, counselors, social workers, students need to have a heightened understanding of what media literacy is. So, as you can see here, media literacy is able to, when you're able to see the messaging, like assess and analyze it, figure out what is the message, what are they trying to get you to do, think, buy, or purchase, and then how does that impact your decision making? Most youngsters and adults don't like to do things when other people are telling them to do it. So when we introduce media literacy to some of the students and young professionals, it's kind of eye-opening. And sometimes we see that pushback in the other way, say, well, if I'm going to buy this or purchase this or act this way, I'm going to do it on my own, not because somebody nudged or ushered me into that area before I was aware of it. So with media literacy, it's not just something that's here in Connecticut. There's a great resource, nonprofit organization out of Massachusetts called Media Literacy Now. And what you can see, they're a strong advocate in moving to get media literacy education in all the states. So you'll see here in these areas, you'll see based on the hue of the state, if they're identified as an advanced leader who's been forward facing for quite some time about this notion of media literacy, or if they are early in the stages and just had some recent legislation passed. So just look at the variety of colors. This is happening. So I recognize that all of our participants who are here may not be in Connecticut physically. I would encourage you to take a look around what media literacy efforts are taking place in your state. So I just thought it would be helpful just to put this here briefly, just because we're all using different types of technology in these days. So again, we didn't want to just have it finger pointing at these young youth or these young people. We use many of these platforms for work, for learning, for school, for social connections, etc. Again, even the best ones could be misused if you're misinformed. And many of us had questions around what are some suggestions that we can offer. So I'm just going to go ahead and put these up here. And this is something that we introduced called the basic model. And it's an acronym, and it says exactly what you would think. So the first one is to be present, being present in your kids' lives, knowing who they're with, not only where they're going, but what are they looking out online. Ask questions, real questions, open-ended questions, not like just did you do your homework? Yes. You know, did you eat? Yes. You know, this, that, and the third. Ask real questions that can elicit some real dialogue in conversation. And the S is for supervise. I like supervise and investigate together because you need to have an idea what your kids are doing. If the kids are using the technology or the device for 7 hours a day, many of them on average, particularly during these last 2 years, what are you doing for oversight? What are they when you walk in the room? Do they put the phone down? Do they put it under the pillow? Or are they so enmeshed in what they're doing that you could walk in and out the room and they don't even notice? Ask questions, supervise and monitor what they're doing, investigate. And my favorite one out of this list is contract. If you're contracting early on, this is an opportunity to be more proactive than reactive. And then you can set healthy boundaries and parameters for your kids, your students, and we could actually extend that out a little bit more, even to your staff and to your coworkers as well. So here was just a few other broader ways that you can think about how you want to approach this notion about social media and well-being and technology. And notice the first one is to be an adult. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have positive relationships with your children because you should, but my friends can't tell me it's time to go to bed. My friends can't tell me go back up those stairs and walk down them again. My friends can't tell me, okay, you've had enough time with the phone or on the game or online. It's time to wrap it up for today. So please find a healthy balance that you could, play a role in your kid's life. And I also like the one join the club. Play the games with the kids. Watch what they're watching. If they're watching YouTube channels, watch with them. If they're watching and binge watching something on other sources, watch it with them, especially the video games. You can see how they learn, how they win, how do they handle losses and defeats. And sometimes for my clinicians who might work with the pediatric population or pre-adolescents, sometimes playing those games could be a conduit for some conversation and discussion that almost mirrors or echoes like play therapy. They're kind of discussing things and don't even realize the density of what they're talking about and sharing. Also could be bonding moments as well. So I'll share this lastly, just as you glance at it, there could be opportunities that you could offer training for your staff. Take a look at what the current existing policies are around social media, use of technology at your agency, and also review the code of ethics around social media. Yes, if you're not aware, the NASW code of ethics has language in there currently that speaks to social media, the use of technology, ethical responsibilities, et cetera, et cetera. And before we go, thought we'd just take a moment to highlight a few good old-fashioned alternatives that cost zero money and don't require Wi-Fi. So just take a look at them. And some of these just promote physical growth, self-care, mindfulness, or even kind of activating your brain in different populated areas to try something different, like a foreign language or a new hobby or a new task. So we just wanted to offer some alternatives that are quick, zero cost, and can be activated initially. And once again, we just put a link here for the website for Welcome to Reality. Not only does Welcome to Reality provide resources around training and education, also around media literacy, equity, and a variety of other services. Oh, and when we talked a little bit about media literacy and the Media Literacy Now component, I'm very proud to share that our colleagues, my partners at Welcome to Reality, initiated lobbying and advocacy for a bill here in Connecticut, 17-67, that got passed unanimously. And what it says is that the state of Connecticut must put together advisory council to find ways to incorporate media literacy, internet safety, and digital citizenship in all public schools. Isn't that an equitable statement? In all public schools. So once again, we have a privilege to work with CSDE and be part of that adoption period in language writing. And if you have children who are currently in the Connecticut school system, be on the lookout for some of the resources that are coming. So if they talk about media literacy and digital citizenship, and you're not sure and it's unfamiliar, well, just remember the time that we spent together. And like I said, we're really happy that we were able to make a contribution to our great state here in Connecticut. Okay, so I think what we'll do here is just go ahead and stop sharing. And I would like to turn it over to Haley and my colleagues for thoughts around how we want to spend the next few minutes.
Yeah, well, first, thank you so much, Professor Stallworth, for this great comprehensive discussion on how social media and technology impact us today, both the pros and the cons. Everyone, please feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question that you'd like to ask Professor Stallworth, or feel free to submit in the chat and I can read it aloud to him. So we'll just get started with the open Q&A now.
Sure.
I have a question from a registrant that was submitted about a week ago that I can offer up to you if that's okay. So someone is curious to know your thoughts on notable changes associated with increased use of technology or social media during COVID, for example, Zoom meetings.
Yes, that's a really good question. And thank you for whoever raised that. So I think that's a great example of one of the benefits and some of the pros. So, what we have seen in the pandemic from a professional perspective, we've been able to utilize platforms like this to work remotely from home safely for those who are working with clients and families. We've seen an increase of having contact with families, particularly on the child protective service side, and you don't have to exhaust time and resources traveling to someone's household where they don't open the door and they're not home. And then also, once again, it's just a great way to kind of congregate together in a purposeful way. And there is a level of comfortability to that as well. The other thing I'd ask you to think about is the other pieces. So for many, the level of physical activity has greatly reduced because we're physically sitting a great majority of the time. And that social interconnectivity, that social aspect, if virtuality is the singular way that you're making connections, over time, it could have an impact in other ways. Really good question. Thank you for asking.
Great, thank you. I actually have another question from a registrant. You mentioned individuals seeking self-esteem via likes, retweets, other things via technology. What are your thoughts on addressing that need for improved self-esteem, particularly for youth at risk of mental health challenges?
Again, another wonderful question. I think, my response is probably going to sound political, but it really isn't, because it's different for everyone. But step one is having an idea of what the young person is encountering. You can only understand that if you have some kind of dialogue and discussion with them. Once we get to a place where there's a critical incident and now everyone's at the table, I imagine that there's been multiple missed opportunities for support. So again, finding ways to use technology and ask questions. Here's a great example. Sometimes when your kids are younger, they might ask you something, you know the answer, but you act like you don't so they could tell you. Think about what that does for self-esteem. So sometimes we'll see students and you can have a conversation and talk about a particular app or a feature or a text phrase or emoji. And they'd be like, what? Miss, who says that? We don't do that anymore. If we were going to do that, wait for it, we do it like this. And those could be opportunities for shared learning. The other side of that is this: technology also could be good for those who struggle with having the courage to voice their thoughts and opinions. So I've also seen a lot of skilled clinicians and support resources use technology for individuals to express. So it might be easier for them to go back and forth versus them to sit in front of them, across a desk or across a couch or in that dynamic. So every situation will be unique, but there are some valuable ways that you can embrace it.
Great, thank you. I'm seeing a question in the chat. Hello, I'm writing a piece on this webinar for UConn's newspaper, The Daily Campus, and I wanted to ask if you could give our readers your main few tips regarding protecting your own well-being and mental health from the harm of social media. Please let me know if you're okay being quoted in the article.
Yes, certainly. So here's what I would ask first. Thank you for uh, making the connection that this was a valuable use of your time, so much so that you'd like to extend it in different audiences. What I would ask you to do, if you're okay with it, is to connect with perhaps Haley, if that's okay, or my contact information, if we could communicate that. I think that that would be a healthy conversation, but probably take more than the handful of moments that we have at this time. But I'd be more than willing.
Awesome, great. It looks like everyone is able to unmute themselves now. If you would like to ask a question directly to Professor Stallworth, please feel free to unmute, and we'll allow a minute or so for that to happen.
Hi, Professor Stallworth. Thank you for the wonderful presentation, first of all. And I have a question regarding any disparities you might have seen among media literacy, and as well as like media usage in populations of different races and ethnic groups, as well as individuals of different socioeconomic statuses.
Yes, once again, great, well thought out and organized question. You know, I think when we talk about disparity, a lot of times we naturally think about the haves versus the have-nots. And I think in this scenario, the relationship is either equal or perhaps inverted. So, in some areas where families might experience resource deficiency, maybe from an economic standpoint or from a material resource standpoint, that could be prevalent. However, having access to technology is a staple that is permeated across many social economical stratas. In fact, I would make the humble argument that in other environments where they might be more densely populated, technology is something that is utilized more so than other areas where they might have the access and the ability to go on a hike or take a trip or build something in the backyard or swim in the pool. So the disparities piece looks different. Some of the local agencies have made intentional efforts to ensure that families have Wi-Fi, especially during the pandemic. Some of the cable industry has offered great resources in that way, but it really goes back to the education and information that the adults have. So if you have access to technology and it's only used for leisure, once again, there could be a myriad of missed opportunities for resource gathering, connecting in other kind of ways, and learning. So again, that's why this conversation around not only media literacy, not just the pros and cons, but offering some solutions and suggestions that can be considered as well. Great question. Thank you for taking the time to ask.
So we might have time for one more question. Oh, I see one in the chat. Are you noticing an increase in social media dependency or addiction with the development of virtual augmented reality technology?
Yes, yes, that is an easy question to answer, and yes. What we're also seeing with some of the games and technology, particularly first-person shooter games, uh, there's a direct correlation between that level of desensitivity, if you will. So, when you play a video game and your man or person dies, you might blink a couple times and then you get a new person. Well, in real life, that's not the case. And also, what it can do, some military aspects, when individuals are injured, they have mock simulated experiences to help almost reintroduce them as close as they can to real world experiences until they're cleared medically to resume service. So some of the things that our children are learning are very sophisticated. They're learning how to hold firearms. They're noting how to reload and do all of these other things. And there could be a direct connection with that disconnect between what's real and what's reality. Hence the reason why we named our company as such. Welcome to reality.
Wonderful. Well, at that point, I guess we will close out for today. I do want to say in the chat, I have shared Professor Stallworth's email address. Thank you for the wonderful questions. And of course, thank you, Professor Stallworth, for your time. And we'll see you next time. Hopefully we'll see you in future webinars through CHASM. So thank you again and take good care.
Take care. Be safe.